Hey everybody, it's Ms. Kennedy with a new 2020 lecture. This is not an old one. You guys get a brand new one this year, and it's all about aquatic biomes, and I hope you enjoy. So I like to start each video with something fun or a meme or whatever, and I've seen this meme a ton recently, and it just makes me really sad. I hope you guys don't feel this way. Obviously, I'm sure most of you do feel like you're not learning anything, you're just submitting things at the deadlines that we assign, but I do hope that you can get something out of this class, and I think it's a really exciting topic, and there's so much sadness and a lot of hope in this class, so I hope that you can, take some of what you learned, tell your families about it, tell your friends about it, think of solutions, and, maybe you can go out and change the planet. But I know I'm being really hopeful, so I just hope in general you don't feel overwhelmed by my class, and if you ever do, just let me know. So just a review of what is a biome. At this point, you should definitely know what a biome is. You did a whole research project on one of them. But on land, a biome is this community of plants and animals that have common characteristics for the environment that they're in. And they can be found all over the world. So some common characteristics would be temperature, precipitation, and the plants and animals that you find there. So if you look at the rainforest, it has a very specific temperature range, very specific amount of rain, it gets a ton of rain, and only certain animals can live there. So the rainforests across the world all have those common characteristics, and that's what makes them a biome. So what's so special about an aquatic biome? Why are we focusing on these in a whole separate lesson? Well, there's some different characteristics that you focus on when you're talking about what makes an aquatic biome an aquatic biome. So you're more focused on things like light availability, how much light gets into the water, something called dissolved oxygen, which is just how much oxygen is in the water, depth, like how deep the water is, obviously temperature as well, and then the currents and the tides that interact with that biome or that water community or environment. So that's what's different from a land biome, and we're going to touch on these different things throughout this lesson. So let's focus on some of the major aquatic biomes. But before we do that, I want to just generally talk about a watershed. A watershed is not a biome, but I do think it's an important thing for you guys to learn about because you're going to hear about it a lot in this class. And the watersheds are super important for our survival. So a watershed is just an area of land where all of the water that's under it, so deep underground, or like draining off of it as rain, it collects in the same place like a river. So all of the water in this picture here will all go into the same area, which would either be this dam and then eventually into the river. So that's a watershed. The water coming from the trees, the farm, the city, the groundwater deep underground, all of that water eventually trickles into this river. So this whole area is called a watershed. And what's cool is watersheds can be super small or really, really large. Like vast amounts of land can be considered a watershed, or they can be super, super tiny. But they all end up pushing water towards the same area, which would be like a river that leads to an ocean. So that's what a watershed is. So really quick, as kind of just like a fun side fact, the New York City watershed is really interesting because we don't really have a lot of like rivers and things that you saw in this first picture to provide us water. So we actually get our water from a watershed that's very far up, like probably an hour and a half away from the city, in this area up here called the Catskills, which is like a beautiful mountain range, tons of beautiful forests and lakes and all that kind of stuff. And there's a watershed there called the Catskill Delaware watershed. There's actually many of them. And basically our water gets funneled from there all the way down to Brooklyn, which is here, through this thing called an aqueduct, which is just like this giant tunnel that you're seeing here. So all of our water is pumped from upstate to Brooklyn, and that's how we drink and that's how we survive, is through this watershed very far away. There's also another one over here called the Croton watershed. I just think that the Catskill one is larger and a little bit more interesting. So just a fun fact. So I know this slide looks crazy, but I just want to test how much you all listen to me. So you should not write anything down from this slide. Just know that streams and rivers are parts of watersheds, obviously. They're where water drains out of. And they can be really different because different areas of streams and rivers can have different amounts of dissolved oxygen, different temperatures, different widths. So that affects like how much stuff can be in them. And then certain areas have more primary productivity, which is, remember, like photosynthesis made by plants. So different areas of streams and rivers can have different amounts, different characteristics. That's all I want you to get from this. And they're a part of the watershed. Same thing over here with this slide. Freshwater ponds and lakes are obviously very important in watersheds, and they have a bunch of different zones that you see here. Again, you don't need to write any of these zones down. I pray they'll never test you on this. It'd be fun if you could know them, but you don't need to know them. Just know, like, if you actually look at these, a lot of the different areas have different net primary productivity, different amounts of nutrients, and different characteristics. So there's like these little mini ecosystems within these mini ecosystems. It's kind of crazy. So not all ponds are alike, not all areas of a pond or a lake are alike. So I just think it's interesting and important to know that there are different amounts of dissolved oxygen at different layers. There's different amounts of light that get into a pond or a lake. So they're not all exactly alike. So next we have inland wetlands, which are still freshwater, and they're things like marshes, which you see up top, swamps, which I think maybe most of you know, and things called floodplains that look like this. So these are like little rivers or streams, and then if a flood occurs, all of this green would be submerged in water. So that's what a floodplain is. And they're just, all of these things, all of these wetlands are areas of land that are covered by water year-round. So there's never going to be a point where any of these areas dry up. They might change their water levels, especially the floodplain, but they'll never dry up of water. And they're really productive because they have tons and tons of nutrients in them from all the different vegetation and animals interacting, and they have tons of sunlight. And these areas are really important habitats for tons of species, and I'll get into why in just a minute. So they provide a ton of different services. They filter out toxic water, they reduce flooding and absorb runoff from storms. So like you saw with the floodplains, they're able to withstand a lot of extra water so they don't flood houses and other areas that aren't meant to flood. They can have a sustainable stream flow. So even in a dry season, there's still water running or in those areas. So that's great for all the animals and plants that rely on water, which is everybody. And they provide tons of habitat, like I said, for all the different creatures that want that water, want that protection from predators, whatever it could be. They provide us a lot of recreation. There's tons and tons of areas where you can actually get into wetlands and make observations, collect data, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of natural products are sourced from our wetlands. So they provide tons and tons of resources and services for our planet. So they're very important. So now we're switching to marine biomes. So we just talked about all the freshwater, and now we're going to switch to marine. Marine just means there's salt in the water. So most of our planet is covered in salt water, so this is a very important biome because lots of biomes exist within the ocean. The ocean itself, so we're talking about the open ocean, it can be divided into these different zones a lot, like the ponds and the streams. You don't need to know those. Just know that at different depths, there's obviously like way down here, there's way different temperature, amount of light, and amount of oxygen than there is up at the very top. So there's a huge difference in those characteristics, which means there's tons of different life. So at the top, there's a lot more life. And at the bottom, I don't know if you've ever seen any documentaries, but the things that live at the deep, deep parts of our ocean are terrifying and also crazy, have amazing adaptations to survive the harsh conditions. So there's a huge range in the open ocean. So next, marine biome is my favorite. There's two. They're estuaries and salt marshes. You might have not heard of these before, but you might recognize them. Salt marshes look like this, kind of like those Florida Everglades, and then an estuary looks like this. So they're really important because they're really biodiverse, some of the most biodiverse biomes on Earth, and you wouldn't expect that just based on looking at them like compared to a rainforest. But they have tons of nutrients and they have a lot of sunlight. As you can see, they're both pretty much like fully exposed to the sun, and they're pretty shallow water, so they get a lot of sun throughout them. And they're cool because they're an area where salt and fresh water meet, and we call this brackish water. So you can see here the ocean is meeting with some type of stream to create this kind of mix of the water. So you get fresh water mixing with salty water to create brackish water, and that's where you get tons of nutrients, tons of life, and that's why these are so important. Probably why I love estuaries and salt marshes so much is because they have something called mangrove trees there, and this is such a common topic in AP Environmental Science that I have to hit on it multiple times throughout the year. So mangroves are trees that are adapted to live in salt water, which is incredibly harsh conditions for almost all plants. No plant really likes, if it's not an ocean plant, it doesn't like salt. If you give your plant salt, it's probably going to die. So these mangrove trees are really special because they're able to take in salt and not die. They're really important for our planet, and you're going to see in this video why. They protect us from storms, like from the water hitting our land, and you'll see what I'm talking about in just a minute. And obviously, they're critical habitat for a lot of species that can be protected by their root systems that look like they're kind of like half in the water, half out. So they're really, really cool for many reasons. So I'm going to show you this quick video that shows you why mangroves are so important for humans. So you can see a heavy current coming in, then it hits the mangrove trees, and these are obviously like a simulation of a mangrove tree. once they pass the mangroves, there's no current at all. So they kind of absorb the impact of heavy waves and heavy storms. Next one in the marine aquatic biomes is the Intertidal Zone. It's my second favorite, and I'll explain why. But it's just this narrow band that you see here along a coastline. And when the tide is high, the Intertidal Zone is covered in water. It's covered in the ocean's waves. When the tide is low, it's exposed to the elements. It's just covered. It's on the sand. And if it's, let's say, a rocky coastline, then the Intertidal Zone is a rocky biome. But if it's a sandy coastline, then it's a sandy biome. So it can be a totally different biome depending on the coast. And it's really hard for species to live there because they're exposed to the elements at low tide. They don't have the protection of the ocean water. And then there's tons of surf coming in and hitting them at really high speeds. Like if you watch waves crashing onto the rocks or the sand, it's kind of intense. So the animals that live there, or the species that live there, have to be really well designed to live in these zones. So intertidal zones are awesome because they create really cool ecosystems that we can often see, and those are usually called tide pools. So there's really famous tide pools where I grew up in San Diego, California. There's this beach called Swami's, and it has these amazing tide pools. If you can catch the currents at the right time, if you go at low tide, you get to play in this amazing area with all these rocks, and then in the water you get to see all these really cool creatures like crabs, starfish, sea anemones, sea urchins, all these amazing little creatures that are like stuck onto the little parts of the tide pools and surviving there the best they can, and then they'll get hit by the waves later when the tide rises again. So it's a really cool place to explore, and they're one of the coolest, most like visual biomes you get to see on Earth. So last aquatic biome, last marine biome is the coral reef. It's probably the most well-known marine biome. And coral reefs love that warm and shallow water. So that's why you see them in tropical areas a lot, because they they can only survive in those characteristics. And fun fact, coral is a live animal. It might not seem like that. You might just think it's a rock, but coral are living. They're very complex in structure, actually. And this very top thing here is called a polyp. And the polyp is alive. It eats algae, not in the way that we eat, but it does need food to survive. And coral reefs, because they have these polyps and because the rocks that they form can become homes to a lot of creatures, there's so much biodiversity in coral reefs. And because of that biodiversity, there's a lot of net primary productivity. A lot of plants can live in coral or on coral, and they create a lot of photosynthesis. They create a lot of energy for ecosystems. So coral reefs are incredibly important for the overall health of our oceans and our whole planet. Alright, so just a recap. This is the end. This is the last slide, but just a recap for everybody. There are a lot of factors that influence the aquatic biomes that are different from land biomes, and those are light availability, water depth, water temperature, so how much light is getting into that ecosystem, how deep the water is, how cold or warm the water is, how much oxygen is getting into that water, and how many nutrients are available. And all of these characteristics can change like foot to foot when it comes to the ocean, or even like area to area of a river. So they're all very different. So that brings me to the next point, that lakes, ponds, streams, and rivers have all these different zones that you don't have to know. All these different zones with different characteristics, like the amount of nutrients at the head of the stream can vary from the bottom of the stream. The temperature in one area of a lake is totally different from another. So they're all very different. And same thing with the ocean environment. There's different biomes within it because it has varying characteristics, just like the freshwater biomes. Another recap is that estuaries are some of the most productive and biodiverse biomes on Earth. And remember, estuaries are those cool things with the mangroves in them, so they're very important and we should protect them at all costs. And lastly, tide pools are really, really cool. So that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed and took some good notes. Bye, everybody.